Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome. As most of you know, I'm Craig Snyder, the president of the World Affairs Council of Philadelphia. Let me start by thanking all of you for joining us for this first installment in our Reimagining Systems series, and also the first of our ticketed webinars. I want to give a special thank you to those who are joining us today as monthly sustaining donors. Hope you'll be back for the other installments in this series and for the growing lineup of I think, really exciting programs that we have coming in the fall. If you have any technical issues that come up during this program, please use your question bar. The Council's Vice President for Programs, Haley Boyle, will help you behind the scenes. And later in the hour, we'll be taking some questions from the audience. In order to ask a question of our speakers, please type it into the question bar. If your question's selected, I will read it aloud. So on to our discussion for this afternoon. We are joined by Jean Desravines, President and CEO of New Leaders, a nonprofit organization with a mission to ensure high academic achievement for all children, especially students in poverty and students of color. By Dr. Douglas Harris, Professor and Department Chair of Economics at Tulane University, and by Dr. William Hite, the Superintendent of the School District of Philadelphia. I'm going to start by asking each of you to make some brief opening remarks under a theme, and that theme is, I guess, the one that is on everyone's mind right now. How is our country doing as a whole in continuing to deliver education, particularly pre-collegiate education, in the face of the pandemic? And are you hopeful that the fall can be better than the spring in terms of the response of the education community to this crisis? Jean, let me start with you, then we will go to Dr. Hite and end the opening with Dr. Harris. Please.
Thank you so much, Greg. It's a pleasure to be with you along with the panelists. I'll start by sharing that I am concerned in the short term and hopeful in the long term. Concerned because the challenges that educators are talking about in Philadelphia as well as throughout the country, they're real. The challenges will only be exacerbated with the opening of schools, concerns around safety, lack of clarity that's being provided at the federal level. I think all of those issues are real and are cause for concern. And yet, I am also hopeful. I am hopeful because, as you pointed out, I lead an organization that's developed and supported 5,000 educators throughout the country. As part of this, we've had a chance to conduct surveys, meet with superintendents, and we've actually launched a virtual leadership academy to help leaders prepare for school reopenings. And there are a set of things that's happening that gives me hope. There's a recognition that this is an opportunity for us to reset, both with the pandemic and racial injustice, to focus on creating an asset-based mindset as opposed to a deficit-set mindset, to reimagine what extended learning needs to look like and how we leverage remote learning in such a way to benefit kids that goes beyond 8 to 2 and 8 months. And fundamentally a sense that school has a critical role to play to address racial inequity. Those things give me hope in the long term around what's possible if we all take the challenge to reimagine what education should look like, particularly for low-income Black and brown kids.
Thank you. Thank you. Dr. Hite.
Thanks, Craig, and thanks for facilitating, and thanks to the World Affairs group that is putting this on out of Philadelphia today. So thank you, and glad to be on with the other panelists as well. And I'll pick up where Jean left off, and I mean, and I do think I think about something that my colleague in Richmond, Virginia, Jason Kamenetz, who's the superintendent there, when asked, how was it like dealing with this set of circumstances? And he said something like the following, and I won't get this exactly right, but he said, it's like playing chess blindfold on one leg in a hurricane. And if you think about all of the challenges that not just urban centers, but if you're operating schools right now, and depending on where you're operating those schools from, so you either have clear guidance about what it is that needs to happen, or in some cases, none at all. And so you're basing everything you do on information that is not coming from a central location, but it's coming from multiple locations. You're basing it on things that you know are right for children, and you're basing it on the things that need to happen in order for professionals to be able to engage with young people, particularly in a virtual environment. And so where I want to pick up where Gene left off is on the optimism point. And I do think that this is an opportunity to rethink how we have traditionally approached teaching and learning, I mean, for the past several hundred years. And I do think it's a way to actually disconnect learning with all of the historical barriers that are associated with schools. Things like seat time and hours and credits, and really think about those skills and abilities and competencies that we want children to have and be able to demonstrate. And then how do we create experiences that allow them to do that? And understanding that learning can take place in multiple places, and it just doesn't have to occur in the schoolroom at a given time for a set of hours. And so I think about all of the opportunities, both as we try to respond to this pandemic, but also all of the challenges that have been presented through all of the racial injustice that has happened and that is been in full view of our communities, and in particular our young people who are really beginning to engage and express their voice for what they feel like they need in order to be productive citizens and learners and individuals who can contribute to the economy here in our city and here in our state.
Okay, Doug, we have two optimists.
Thanks, Craig, and I'll pick up a little bit from where the other speakers left off. We don't use hurricane analogies here down in New Orleans, but the idea is right. I think there's a lot of uncertainty, and I think in the current situation, in some ways, schools face more uncertainty than almost any other kind of organization, because everything that happens in a school, and this is true generally, not just in a crisis, but the schools are so intertwined with the rest of society, and how whether businesses are open, and whether mass transit is available, and the public health system obviously being prime among them now. That makes it really hard to plan. So Dr. Haidt, I feel your pain having to try to plan all these different scenarios and it just makes it so much harder to do anything excellently, because you're having to plan all these different scenarios and put resources, sort of spread the resources out and try to be ready for anything. But if you're ready for anything, it means you're not extremely well prepared for anything in the process. That's just the situation we're in. I think schools have responded under those conditions, have responded okay. I don't think anybody believes we're providing an excellent education right now. I'm not sure it's conceivable that we could, even if we had planned really well, even if we had known this was happening, I think it would have been very difficult to provide an excellent education, just because the simple technology, if you will, of the classroom is actually pretty impressive. Like there's so much you can do in a classroom, and it's so hard to replicate what you can do in a classroom outside of that setting. So I think we've done okay under the circumstances. Fundamentally, this is a public health crisis, and we needed to close the schools. and close the school buildings. And we may still need to keep them closed for a while longer until that crisis subsides. And we're just going to have to do the best we can on the education front in the meantime. It looks like this is going to be one more year. The good news is it looks like probably only one more year that we'll have a vaccine in the near future, and we'll be able to mass produce that. And hopefully next fall we get to have more to choose for ourselves what education looks like, rather than having the health crisis choose for us. So I think we need to muddle through as well as we can in this next year. We've done okay so far. I think we'll do better in the fall than we did in the spring for a couple of reasons. One is we've now had the experience of the spring that had no planning behind it. So we've got educators now who are more familiar with different educational technologies. Parents and students are more familiar with those technologies, and some shifts towards those tools, some of which are really impressive. That's already occurred, and people know how to use them better now. There's been more planning, even despite the uncertainty. There's more planning that's gone into it. So I think the fall will be better. There will likely be some in-person instruction, at least for some students in some places that we didn't have in that late spring. So I think this year will be better, and the year after that will be better still.
Thank you. Thanks all of you. Dr. Haidt, let me come back to you on the question of planning and the question of muddling through. So as I'm sure our audience all knows, the Philadelphia School District initially announced a hybrid approach to the fall with some in-person and some distance learning. A number of other major city districts had already announced a 100% distance learning approach at that point. I know that there are an uncountable number of factors that went into that initial recommendation, but I want to ask you to give our audience the key factors that went first into the hybrid decision, and then why a revision has now been made to implement 100% digital learning for the beginning of the school year.
Yeah, thanks, Craig. Thanks for the question. And to your point, we actually have been doing some work since we were out on how we would return, and how critically important it was for us to get young people with adults and in front of teachers, and teachers in front of students at the very least a few times a week. So we commenced to having survey results like many of my colleagues from around the country. We surveyed and collected some 36,000 responses. And of those responses, about 62% of the individuals indicated a support for some form of in-person instruction as in the form of a hybrid model, as long as there was an option for some virtual learning if in fact a family wanted to remain all virtual. Those survey results match pretty closely to survey results that our teachers union received after they put out a survey that also indicated that their support was for a hybrid model, albeit it was a different hybrid model than ours. And so I'm hearing an echo for some reason. That created for us the opportunity to look at a hybrid model that would bring children in 2 days a week. They would be digital 3 days a week, and then anyone would have the option of going completely virtual. So after the meeting, we had to approve that. We had some 100 plus individuals come and speak in opposition of that plan as individuals begin to see cases start to spike again. And based on all of the information that we heard at the meeting, we have now revised our reopening plan to be fully virtual, at least for the first grading period, and then transition or phase into a hybrid model after that time. And that will allow us to do several things. One, to ensure that we can get facilities into a place that are appropriate to support children. It also will allow us to have students working with the teachers in the schools with whom they are assigned. That was what we heard loud and clear from individuals who wanted a virtual experience, but they wanted their teachers. They didn't want other teachers with their young people. And then it provides us with the opportunity to then train individuals on how to utilize the digital tools that they would need to use once we return to school. So it was first, as you indicated, a recommendation for a hybrid model that included an option for all virtual. Now we have gone into a phased approach where we will begin all virtual and then move hopefully to hybrid in the event the health commissioner and others have indicated that it is safe to do so at that time, with a view towards moving more and more children to more regular days per week, we hope, as the year moves or as the year progresses.
I'm muted.
Doug, I wanted to turn to you. You have a book coming out in August titled Charter City School: What the End of Traditional Public Schools in New Orleans Means for American Education. We urge our audience to read the book in full, but for the moment, can you summarize the main findings that you're reporting in the book as to how the education response to Hurricane Katrina is relevant to what the country is now facing?
I think it's relevant in two ways. One is the hurricane itself is in some ways like the crisis that we're in, not in all ways, but in some ways. We're facing a situation now where students are forced out of school buildings. They're going through some trauma in their personal lives. There's an economic impact on the family. There's trauma and disruption. All those things are similar to what happened with Katrina. And so we're starting to look back to what the effect of Katrina was itself on students to try to better understand and try to get ahead of some of these problems. For example, there's been a lot of focus on getting younger kids back to school, but we also worry that students who are in those gateway grades and situations, so students getting towards the end of high school, they're older and they can manage themselves better on average, but that's a really critical gateway, not getting to graduation. So we're looking back and trying to understand that it does look like that those students were particularly harmed and struggled. So it's not just the younger kids who are going to struggle in this situation; the older kids will as well. And the second reason the Katrina situation is relevant is because Katrina spawned this whole school reform effort in the city. So, in brief, in just a short span, the state took over almost all the schools, turned almost all of them into charter schools, and now it is an all-charter city, which is where the book title comes from. Eliminated attendance zones so that students could, in theory, choose any school they wanted. Teachers didn't have tenure. There were no union contract. Everything that we're accustomed to in a traditional school district was ended. Now, I don't anticipate any of that happening, and in many ways shouldn't happen on a national level. But I do think that there is some relevance to it in that we're talking about rethinking schools. I think both Gene and Dr. Haidt both mentioned the idea of rethinking schools, and that's certainly what happened after Katrina. To me, what's relevant isn't so much the particular reform that happened in New Orleans in this context, but the way in which some of it happened. So let me just give one quick example. One of the things that happened as a result of the hurricane itself, it had nothing to do with the ideology of school reform or anything like that, but when people were coming back to the city, they were coming back in unpredictable patterns, and so there was no way to have attendance zones in the aftermath of Katrina. We had to, because there were only a few parts of the city that were unaffected where we could have school buildings open. We had to bus people from wherever they happened to be when they came back to those school buildings. So we had to get rid of attendance zones because of Katrina, not because of school reform. And the reason I bring that example up isn't because I'm advocating for that as a policy, but because it's an example of how crises force us to do things differently in ways that have nothing to do with our the ways in which we had normally thought about education systems. So we were forced into doing choice in New Orleans. COVID is forcing us to learn new educational tools, change our schedules, change learning time, change the way we think about, as Dr. Haidt said, that seat time versus an outcomes-oriented way of thinking about education. So what's happening now is we're being forced into doing things differently and thinking about things in new ways. And some of those are good things. I'm not saying all of those are necessarily good ideas, but we are being forced into new habits. And the new default is what we're doing right now, which is totally different from what we were doing before. Teachers, parents, students are learning new online tools that they weren't familiar with before. Some of those are going to like and are going to be really effective, and they're going to want to continue those. I've got a 13-year-old who's home, and I asked her the other day, do you want to go back to your old schedule of getting up early in the morning and getting to school at 8 a.m.? She said, no, I don't want to go back to that. Right. So I think there are all sorts of examples like that where I think we're going to start to take another look at the things that were the norm that we've now been forced out of and may have long-term impacts.
Unmuted.
So, Jean, let me go to you. Long before the pandemic, you were working to address the particular education needs for students in poverty. Do you think that this pandemic experience is going to create further gaps? It's going to worsen gaps, as I've certainly seen some argue, in both educational opportunity and achievement, or could it mark a turning point towards better ways to address those gaps?
Thank you for asking that question, Greg. Important for all of us to underscore the point that long before the pandemic, we had shameful achievement gaps in our country. I've been fortunate enough to work with Dr. Haidt even before Philadelphia when he was in Prince George's County, and we've had a set of leaders who've been courageous enough to discuss, to address, and to push for strategies to address those gaps. And from my perspective, I think now we are at an inflection point as a country. The pandemic itself, along with the killing of George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, has sparked a national conversation around the realities of systemic racism that we have been trying to address as a country. And I think it is now up to us to decide which path we go in. Will we make the difficult decisions that Dr. Haidt and Doug alluded to in terms of how we allocate resources, both in terms of financial and human resources, to address students who are often marginalized and left behind? How do we think fundamentally differently about engaging parents and communities who it's become really clear in time of crisis that they're at the forefront and they care deeply about educating their kids and their families? And how do we create anti-racist classrooms, schools in such a way that we're driving outcomes? It's a choice, and it's a choice that I think now we are positioned to make. And whether or not we use this as an excuse to further achievement gaps, or we use it as an opportunity to make the tough decisions we need to make in order to address it, I think is totally up to us. I remain hopeful and optimistic that we'll make the right choices.
Unmuted.
So let me play devil's advocate just a little bit in terms of the commonality of optimism here, that we will make right choices and have wise policies. There are a lot of parents who are despondent over the prospect of continued remote learning for even just the beginning of the next school year, much less if it stretches into the entirety. And the New York Times wrote a piece just a couple days ago about parents who had never before considered homeschooling, particularly affluent parents who'd never before considered homeschooling have begun to look into it, hiring private tutors, all sorts of things that obviously are not available. The means are not available for a majority of folks, but things that could lead to a widening of gaps rather than a shrinking of gaps. One person, let's see, quoted in the Times article, a writer for Tablet magazine, posed it as a question, but I think was expressing a point of view. It said, did public schools in major cities just deal themselves a death blow with fully online education? So I want to put this out to all three of you and answer in any order that you'd like. Essentially, what do you see as the dangers of the reality of online education in the fall to the long-term health of the K through 12 system?
So Craig, I'll start because I wanted to. Gene said something that triggered a thought, and the thought is that, like, when I think about the inequities that exist and we experienced that as soon as we had to go virtual, and we experienced that there were individuals with means to do certain things that were making one request, while we had others who actually had no idea how to do those things. But not only did it elevate the inequities around education and education attainment, but it elevated the inequities around food insecurity, access to health care, safety, behavior health, all of those systemic structures that we've talked around but have not really dealt with directly. And all of those things then we are trying to navigate as we move forward. You asked a question of whether or not young people who have been impacted already are going to be further impacted by this. And in my opinion, the answer is unequivocally yes, they're going to be impacted. And it's going to be impacted negatively by this because we've lost time and we've lost the opportunity. And oh, by the way, we had to train 7,500 teachers on how to use the new technology because they had not been exposed to those platforms before. Do I think we're going to get better at it as we move forward? Yes, is the answer to that. But we have lost time for young people who are learning to read. We have lost time for young people who are learning how to do math. And we've lost that critically important socialization that needs to occur with not just our youngest students, but as Doug said earlier, many of our older students as well who said, look, I just want to see my friends and be able to have a conversation. And so we've lost some critically important opportunities, not just for educational attainment, but for the necessary socialization that has to occur and that should be occurring with young people as we think through this work moving forward. And while that's another reason why we said we wanted children to be in school at least a part of the time, because it was just extremely important that we don't allow those who do not have the means to have a private tutor or do the homeschool or do some of the things that you described. We do not have any more time to lose with those children because they're just getting further and further behind. And I do think that's going to be impacted. I think what we come out on the other side in the long run will likely be better, but it's going to take us some time to get there. And we will be fooling ourselves if we suggested that children are going to be in the same place that they were if in fact there wasn't a disruption to last year, and that the fact that we're going to begin this year all virtual.
So just to reiterate, I think the idea that the educational inequality in the short term is going to get worse for sure. And I think Gene was optimistic about it getting better in the long term. I'm actually less optimistic. So I think, Greg, you were looking for some less optimism. So here's a point in which I'm not that optimistic, because if you listen to the conversation, that there's not much in the conversation that's leading to changes in policy or ideas that would likely lead to a reduction in inequality in the long run. So that part, there's a lot of general conversation, fortunately, in the context of George Floyd and the appropriate moves and anti-racism. Those are great general ideas, but when I listen to the school conversation, I don't hear it reflected in ideas that at least yet are going to make a meaningful impact. The second point, going back to your original question, you mentioned homeschooling and possible more radical a change in the structure of education, maybe something like New Orleans, at least in terms of the size of the impact on the education system. I think it's less likely to change in a really significant way than what it seems. Schools are really powerful institutions, but as I suggested earlier, like having children go to school buildings on a regular basis and learning in a classroom with a teacher in ways that we're all familiar with isn't just some old-fashioned idea that we stick to for no good reason. There are actually really good reasons why we do that, and so I think you're not going to see a mass move towards homeschooling because parents need to work and they're not teachers, and children want to go to school and they want to see their friends, and all the reasons why going to a school building is for the vast majority of students a good thing to do on a regular basis, on a daily basis, that's going to continue. I do think, though, we may see something in between kind of where we were and a shift to homeschooling, which is kind of changes in the schedule. So I can easily imagine high schools changing their schedules to have students not starting school at 8 in the morning, which we all know isn't really sensible from a physical health standpoint for teenagers. Having them do more work at home, perhaps in general, this interaction between what happens in the classroom and what's happening at home can work really well when teachers are able to see students on a fairly regular basis, not necessarily every day at 1 hour per day the way we often structure schooling. So I can definitely see changes in the structure of schooling, how much time exactly is at home versus in school, but I don't think we're going to see a major shift towards homeschooling.
Yeah.
I do see, though, to Doug's point, not so much I agree on the homeschool, but I do think that there are other choices that families can make based on what those families must do, whether it is getting back to work or making sure that their children are in some place. And so, and what I mean by that is, in the city of Philadelphia, and we have surrounding communities that may be in-person learning. We have the Catholic schools who may go 5 days a week. And I think those opportunities present options for families that need to put their children somewhere that could create for us a widening of the gap, if you will, because those with the ability to make those choices could likely make those choices.
Yeah, and to just build on both of these points around the view that unfortunately it will likely get worse before it gets better, I think there's consensus on it. Greg, to your question, the irony of the question around is virtual learning a death blow to K-12 education. I think if you look at elite private schools in the K-12 system, they're actually mostly making the decision to go virtual without any major difficulties. And they're doing it because they have the resources to be able to do it. They've got the safety net of parents who are able to say, we will provide enrichment services, we will be able to provide coaching and counselors and support for our kids. And what this moment in time underscores, and I know we'll talk about this later, is a value question for us as a country around what is truly important. What are we going to invest in to ensure that we set up our kids for success? And if we're not willing to make some of the investments that we know is necessary, then it's absolutely correct that our kids will be much further behind, not only in the short term, but in the long term. And if we're not willing to spark conversations around innovations and different ideas in this moment in time, then we will continue to regress in terms of how we support our kids.
Unmuted.
So let's, if we could, talk about some of those ideas, what those policies would look like, right? Looking beyond the pandemic at sort of the broader education policy discussion. It seems to me very unlikely. I think you'll agree that this is going to cause a fundamental structural change in the way public education is mostly paid for in the United States. That is tied to local property taxes. And so there's sort of a question as to what are the maximum practically available, practically achievable policy reforms that could address the differential in resources, Gene, that you were talking about. And I just want to kind of go around and I'm asking you pie in the sky. I'm not really asking you what sort of the political gamesmanship of how these things would happen, but what sort of policies do you think might be feasible to address that resource gap question? Dr. Haidt, can we start with you?
Sure. I mean, starting with the state that is the most inequitable in terms of their public school funding, and that is unfortunately Pennsylvania, and between rich and poor districts. But I do think that how we think about the monies following young people and monies actually that are provided based on concentrations of children in poverty and what those young people need, to Gene's point, and thinking about some of the other wraparound services like those that we see at elite schools that are performing, and how are we able to do that? And one of the ways here in Philadelphia that we are attempting to do that is to use the entire the entire landscape of assets. And what I mean by that is there are city agencies that are now providing supportive work in our communities in the form of behavioral health or mental health for families and children. But it keeps the school district from having to take that on as a budgetary challenge for us. And so we're able to get now therapeutic support, behavior health, into every single school because we are partnering with Office of Behavior Health and putting data together that's informing where we put these resources. So now we have social workers who are paid for through a city agency that can actually help support children in schools. And I think that's a way to think differently about just the landscape of assets that are available and out there. And instead of us as a school district saying we're going to budget for this many social workers who are then bumping into the social workers who are already assigned to that community, and thinking about it differently as a more comprehensive way to target resources and assets that are responsive to the needs of young people in the communities. And I just think that's one way to think about redirecting resources in a way that is more purposeful and responsive to the needs of children and families.
So a couple other observations. I think you're asking about how we fund schools fundamentally, and you had two words in there, or three words: local property tax. And I think the key thing really is the local funding versus where it's coming from. So Louisiana, for example, actually has a pretty heavily property tax funded system, but it's much more state driven. So it's more who's deciding the resource levels rather than what the funding mechanism is per se. So you can have an equitable funding system based on property taxes, and the question is whether states will step in on that. In fact, we've made some progress on that over the last several decades nationally. A lot of states have had school finance reforms that have taken more of the responsibility up to the state level and have more equitably distributed resources. I think that's going to be harder in the medium term when I say that in like the next 5 years or so, because the next 5 years, economically speaking, is going to be a really difficult time. This is, even if things go well and we get a vaccine and schools reopen and everything reopens, this is going to be probably worse than the Great Recession was in terms of economic impact. And it's going to be very difficult for states to put in additional resources, which is usually what's necessary to make school finance reform work. It tends to happen when times are good and you have extra resources that you can devote to lower spending school districts. So it's going to be a long time before that happens. The federal government, however, I think could and likely will step in and play a larger role, not just in the short term, but probably in the long term as well. I think there's more support for it on both sides of the aisle, especially amongst Democrats, for increased federal funding. And what's going to have to happen now with congressional funding that does have truly bipartisan support, I think maybe one step down that road towards a larger federal role to help reduce those gaps. Some of the gaps are across states, and those are the ones that the federal government is best positioned to help with. Some of the gaps are also within states, and that's really where the state school finance reform will have to come in.
Yeah, I totally agree with Doug's point, and I'll just add a couple building off of Billy and Doug's points. Like, we knew before the pandemic, there was a report by the Century Foundation, and it outlined that schools were underfunded by $150 billion before the pandemic. And market researchers found that there's a $23 billion funding gap between white and non-white school districts. We know, just given where local and state, the ability to increase funding will be non-existent. And yet part of the reason why I keep raising the theme around hope is that as it's clear that there is some bipartisan support and really that schools are more important now than they've ever been, and that there's going to be a significant investment from the federal government. But as the federal government thinks about the investments, it's so critically important to think about providing local leaders with the discretion to be able to use the money as they see fit. Dr. Haidt and his colleagues are much better equipped than any leader in the federal government to decide how funding should be utilized. And the hope is that as a stimulus package comes out, that the flexibilities will be given to local leaders to expend the funding in terms of how they see best for their students.
Unmuted.
Let me sort of stick with the devil's advocate role. All of you are talking about the need for additional resources. There is, of course, a school of thought that says that the question of school outcomes is not primarily one of the country not spending enough money, but rather spending what we do spend poorly, or not as well as we could, at least. And that gives rise, I think, to two particular lines of argument, one of which is that the dollars should follow the student, and therefore that there should be the ability to choose, for parents to choose private schools as well as public schools, and to get, the argument goes, to get competition into the system. And the other sort of stream of thought that's related to that is that the teachers' unions have often been concerned primarily with the pay and benefits of the educators, and not necessarily with the outcomes for the students. There has been a real sea change in the United States, I think particularly within the Democratic Party, in terms of looking at police unions as an obstacle to police reform. Is there a time coming, perhaps, when folks will start to see teachers' unions as an obstacle to education reform? I'm going to let anybody jump in who'd like.
But just a couple observations. I think one is on the teacher salary part. Teachers are not paid especially well. I know that you sometimes see headlines to the contrary, but the salaries of teachers relative to other jobs that require a bachelor's degree, for example, has been declining over time, making it harder for schools to attract and retain teachers. You look at the cars that teachers drive. You look at they're not making off with huge amounts of money here. The second, on the school reform part, which I think is how I took the first part of the question, do we need to change the system rather than change the resources? The New Orleans example often comes up in this case because it was such a radical reform. It kind of did all of the things that that reformers had talked about doing and did it all at once. But I think New Orleans did some things right and some things wrong. And the things they did right are the things that are a package of things that have to happen together. There needs to be accountability. So New Orleans had actually pretty strict accountability. They had pretty good, transparency about what the charter schools were doing. They required the charter schools to accept all students, and they couldn't exclude students. There was that oversight there. So they got a lot of those pieces right. And I think when you do, if you talk about any one of those pieces that you mentioned, I'm not sure that's going to do us much good. A lot of those things have been happening or have been tried in different places. But I think there are ways to combine those things together, and whether we're doing that within the traditional public school system and trying to make changes there, or talking about these things as charter schools, I think those are the elements that you need. And just shifting to private schools, for example, or giving money to families to go to private schools where there's no oversight, no transparency, no accountability, the research is not very supportive that that's going to be helpful to students' educational outcomes.
Yeah. And I'm happy you asked that question, Greg, because I do think there's a risk if it's only framed as we need additional financial resources. I think it is easy to get pushback and for people to dismiss it. Because you don't need additional financial resources to set high expectations for kids. You don't need additional resources to ensure that kids are learning to standards to be prepared for college and careers. So being able to have those difficult conversations to say that is not a matter of resources, it's a matter of expectations, a will, a focus on results orientation, and it's incumbent upon leaders to be willing to have those difficult conversations. And it's also equally as important to say, if you've got leaders that gotta worry about the safety of their teachers, their kids going back to school during a pandemic, if you've got to worry about technology and making sure that there's access to internet connectivity for your kids so they can learn virtually, those things do require resources. Being really clear about the pieces that we can move forward with without resources, and with reallocation of resources, and pieces that require resources, I think is important for the conversation not to be dismissed out of hand.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, I think that I'm going to take a slightly different tack or path on this as well. And I do think that as we think about the same structures that I talked about with respect to the knowledge and skills that we need for children to be successful upon graduation, there are also certain behaviors that we need from our educators and being able to think about what structures support those types of conditions or behaviors or activities. And so I think that we can no longer think about the job writ large as an hourly wage type of job, because you have to think about how do we develop individuals, and then based on that, how do we use the time that we have in order to do those developmental things. I don't think our teachers union has been blocking anything that we've been attempting to do through negotiations. We have now the ability to select at the site level who comes into schools. We have the ability to actually work together to talk about who needs additional support or who should be dismissed. Those are things that we've been able to accomplish. I'll also say our teachers, to a point that Doug made, our teachers are the ones on the front line working every day to actually help educate our young people in conditions that other individuals would say, hey, I don't know how you or why you would continue to do that based on the conditions, but they're doing it because they have a commitment to children. But Craig, I think the important point is, and I've said this before, so people talk about the monies that we spend, although we're spending about $10,000 less per child than one of our wealthy suburbs. And and then when the suburb is referenced, it is, oh, isn't it great that they're able to spend that type of money for children? So if it's good for them, how come it's not good for us in terms of increasing the amount that we spend per child? And so I agree. I think that there are structures there that in the past may have prevented individuals from doing certain things. I think some of those structures still exist around, like the pension costs being passed back to school districts to maintain that becomes a fixed amount for us. Charter schools, in terms of how they are funded here in PA. And I think all of those create fixed expenses for us that don't allow us to actually move those things around. But then the only things that then we can address are those things that are in schools for the children that we serve. And so I think we have to deal with all of those structures, but we just can't say, hey, if you just give an allotment for someone to take their child from this school to go to that school, I don't think that's going to fundamentally solve the problem. I think we have to look more wholesale and comprehensively at a system or structure that provides funding per child based on what that child needs in order to be educated.
Thank you. We've had a few questions come in from the audience. I want to go through them. Ask if you can have sort of relatively brief answers so we can get through a few in the time we have left. First question: how can we allow opening plans to be done school by school and expect businesses and employees to make any job sustainability plans when their kids are in such a state of flux?
I think that's tough. I mean, I think that's really tough. And I talked about it earlier in terms of when there's no guidance, and then there are 500 school districts in the Commonwealth of PA. And it is very easy for, because I've worked in Maryland, as Gene indicated before, and there were only 24 districts there, I get it. But there was much tighter guidance around schools will open this way or that way. And so that each school district is not trying to create its own plan to solve for multiple types of things when individuals are working across jurisdictions and one is impacting the other. We originally had to close our schools, Craig, because the districts around us closed, and because they were ordered to shelter and play or stay at home. We had to close our schools as a result of that. And so that it's an example of how one action can actually determine the results for school districts in and around a particular area.
Just one quick addition. I think it's probably less about the schools making decisions or school districts making the decisions than it is about the uncertainty of the crisis itself. I think you'll find that schools and districts are going to generally do the same things given the conditions around them. It's that the conditions are uncertain. So we don't know what's going to happen next with the pandemic. That's really I think the bigger problem. And even if you had the state, let's say, determining, I'm not saying we should do this, but even if the state were deciding what to do, you still wouldn't know what's going to happen a month from now because the state also doesn't know what's going to happen with the pandemic.
One of our questioners really wants us to focus on the kids who have the least resources. And the question is, what about getting resources to, for example, homeless students? Things like internet access, computers for them to use. Obviously, Dr. Haidt, you've been making efforts in this regard. Perhaps we could just go quickly around on this thought. Gene, why don't we start with you here?
I'm muted.
All right, Gene's frozen up. Doug, why don't you jump in if you could?
Actually, I'd be more interested in what Dr. Haidt has to say on this one.
Oh, thank you, Doug. Yeah, I was just going to say we delivered we actually had to take we had to we had to take those resources to the children. First, we had to find the children and the families, and then we had to take those resources to children. And we're very concerned about that here in the city of Philadelphia, because it's also been a high eviction rate, now that I understand. And so I'm more worried about that moving forward. But when we can't reach a family or a family cannot get to us, then we actually get those resources to families. We purchased 86,000 Chromebooks to distribute, and we are distributing Wi-Fi devices, portable Wi-Fi, to families, particularly those who are homeless.
One other thing that I think we could think about, Dr. Hyde, I'd be interested in your view on this, is bringing back certain students into the school building, even when the school building is not broadly open to everybody. So homeless students would be towards the top of the list, students with disabilities, English language learners, and so on. What do you think of that?
Yeah, absolutely. And Doug, thank you for referencing that point. We also are working like across agencies now, particularly with the city, and we are identifying both schools and other places, rec centers, libraries, places of worship, and in addition to schools, that could be these centers for vulnerable youth, and in some cases, youth with complex needs. And our homeless students fall into that category.
Get you in on this if we could.
Craig, I think you were muted.
Yes. We lost Gene again. All right. Well, the technology works some of the time, as we're seeing. All right. Last question that we have here is what more can we do to support, on the one hand, parents, and on the other hand, teachers?
Most absolutely right, and we're actually working with about 1,000 educators across the country. This is the reason the school leaders, principals play such a critical role in this.
Unmuted.
Technology. If you would, Dr. Hyde, parents and teachers, to your other two constituencies in addition to the kids themselves.
Yeah, two very important issues, and particularly our families, and helping families actually deal with the trauma that is associated around them. Some of them who've lost jobs, lost wages, they don't know what to do and how to support their children. We created what we called a Hope Line, which was a counseling center for them, and so that they could call in and actually talk through, and we could talk through counselors and get psychologists to talk with them to help them. In addition, we have done virtual meetings for them on how to utilize the resources that we are providing. And then there are even some support centers where they can go and actually be given step-by-step guidance on how to do that. With respect to the teachers, I talked about the 7,500 that we had to teach before they started using the technology. And we have pushed the start of our school year back to make sure we're also able to instruct those individuals on the new digital supports and programs that we will be implementing in the fall.
Gene, do we have you back? Do we have you back, Gene?
I'm back, Greg.
Excellent. Well, then I wanted to get on sort of the last two questions. Students, the most at-risk students, such as homeless students, and then the issue of teachers and parents. What should we be doing in this time with respect to those three different important groups?
Great question. I would say for our most vulnerable students, we should actually have them at the very top of the list. Doug alluded to it. We have the principals that we're working with. They're actually they're going into homeless shelters, working with guidance counselors, working with resources within to provide as much resources to homeless students, giving them Wi-Fi connectivity, making sure that they're eating and so forth. the point that Bill made is such a critical point around the social emotional components that's needed for teachers and parents. Before, the focus was on how do you provide that level of support to kids, but now as educators, we've got to ensure we're providing that same level of support to both teachers and staff members, and that means providing the guidance support, working with different agencies to ensure that virtually they're getting the type of support that they need from a mental standpoint to weather these uncertain times.
Unmuted.
Any last words, Doug?
No, I think what's interesting about the current situation is that the relationship between schools and parents has changed. So, it used to be that they were always intertwined, right? There was always a partnership between schools and parents in the education of children. It's now, the balance has shifted, right? So now we just moved it home. And so I think the relationship between teachers and parents in particular, I think has taken on a renewed importance. And so I think it's going to be critical for them to stay in close touch and, as Dr. Height said, to have professional development for the teachers, but on these new tools, but also they may need professional development on how to interact with parents and how to work with them as co-partners in this unfortunate situation that we're in.
Unmuted.
Well, with that, we've run out of time, but I want to thank the three of you for participating in this discussion. I want to thank our audience for being with us. Hopefully, we will see you again in our next installment. And we are, for this evening, adjourned. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you. Thank you.